Hi, welcome to this module. My name is Adeline Mertena. I'm a project officer at Sandec, and today I will talk to you about how to trigger community participation using a behavior change approach. To do so, I will first introduce you why using a behavior change approach to trigger community participation is important. What are the factors influencing the behavior? There I will introduce you to the Ranas factor and related approach, which is an approach based on psychological theory, which has been used in many water, sanitation, and waste projects around the world. Finally, I will show you how we can use the Ranas results to adapt behavior change intervention to hopefully succeed in a behavior change. So, in conventional intervention, we often tend to think that if we would deliver an infrastructure to someone, people will magically start to use it adequately. Well, in reality, that's not so easy. Let's take a look at this example. We have some different waste bins where people can put their different waste. So far, so good. But if we have a closer look into the organic waste bin, what we can see is actually with orange and banana peel, you also have plastic bags and packaging. So actually, it was not used very adequately. Or even sometimes, you have people that don't use the infrastructure at all, like in this example, where you see that you have some waste containers, but you have waste all over the floor. So why didn't it work? Well, because the problem of this conventional approach is that actually there is something missing in the middle, or better said, someone, and we don't know what is happening in the head of this person. This person, his or her thoughts, behavior, it's like a black box. And we need to know more about it in order to succeed in a behavior change, to make them do what we want and expect them to do. Now it's time to go deeper into that black box. Let's take our example of supplying separated bins to make people segregate their waste. According to the psychological theory, what is inside the black box are actually the different factors that people have in mind and which influences their behavior, such as factor A, B, or C. These factors can be knowledge, perceived social pressure, attitudes, belief about cost and benefits, and so on and so forth. And these factors will determine whether or not the person will do the expected behavior. In this case, segregating the waste. The idea is that once we know what are the factors that make someone do a certain behavior, we can develop techniques, so-called behavior change techniques, that are actually interventions, such as doing workshop, delivering flyers, and so on and so forth. And this intervention will influence these factors in other person's mind who doesn't do yet the expected behavior. Okay, but how to identify this factor then? Well, to do so, we need to compare this factor for people doing the behavior, doers, and people who doesn't do the behavior, non-doers, and we compare the results. In this example, we can see that factor A are similar between doers and non-doers, but factor C and B are different. Thanks to that, we can actually conclude that factor B and C seems to be important for doing the behavior. Okay, enough of factor A, B, and C. Let's have a look at what that means exactly. This is an example from Bolivia, where you have someone in the middle explaining how to separate the waste and why it's important to do so. But the why and how are not the only question that this woman can have in mind while listening to him. In this case, they could also ask themselves, am I at risk? And why? Can it really affect my health to not separate my waste? What are the cost and benefit? Is it worth it to separate it? What will the other say? Will they say that I'm losing my time, or will they be proud of me? Can I actually do it? Do I have enough space at home to have different trash bins? How can I manage it? Will I have enough time to take out my trash bins and give it to the waste collection truck at the right time? Do I actually like it to separate my waste? So, what do all these questions mean from a psychological perspective? Based on the Ranas psychological approach, each of these questions can actually be associated to different factors. Risk, which is related to person understanding and awareness of the health risk. Attitudes, where person's positive or negative position towards a behavior is targeted. Norm, the perceived social pressure towards a behavior. The ability, a person's confidence in his or her ability to practice a behavior. And finally, self-regulation, the person attempts to plan and self-monitor a behavior and to manage barriers and conflicting goals. They will lead to a certain belief and will influence a person's intention to do a certain behavior, to use a device, or even to form an habit. Now, if you want to achieve a behavior change, we can use different behavior change techniques. For example, for the risk, you will spread information on how not well-managed waste affect your health and the environment, for example. For attitude, you could reward people segregating their waste. For norm, you can initiate public commitment for segregating the waste. For ability, you can do workshop where you provide instruction and infrastructure on how to segregate the waste at home. For self-regulation, you can help defining planning for households for the waste segregation management, etc. And of course, social, physical, and personal context is important when you define the strategy that you want to use. Okay, now that we are more familiar with the Ranas approach, let's have a look on how to use it step by step. Here in this graph, you can see different columns with the phases, the tools, and the outputs that are at the core of the Ranas systematic behavior change approach. Once we define which behavior we want to target or change in the project, we can start with phase 1, where we will identify potential behavioral and contextual factors with the help of the Ranas model in order to create a survey. Thanks to that, you will know what are the behavioral factors you want to test. In the second phase, you will measure and determine the key behavioral factor by analyzing and comparing the result between doers and non-doers. Then you will know what are the key behavioral factors you have to change. Then, based on that, you can select behavior change techniques and design behavior change strategies. For that, you can use a catalog of techniques. Then, when you know which behavior change technique you want to apply, you can start implement and evaluate behavior change strategies. You do a before and after control, and then you know which strategy works best in your case. And then finally, you will succeed in an effective behavior change. Let's take example A. We did the Ranas survey, we identified doers and non-doers, and we get the following graph, where you can see the different Ranas factors on this axis, and on this one you have a grading from low importance to high importance given by people. If you compare the results between doers and non-doers, what this graph shows is that first, from risk, both is quite high and doesn't have much difference between doers and non-doers. Norm is quite low, and ability seems to be the most critical factor, as it shows a big difference between doers and non-doers. This means that in this case, we should choose interventions, such as workshop, where we will explain how to separate the waste, and we will even give material for people to do it at home. We can also work on the norm factor to give more visibility to what the others do. But in that specific example, giving information on health risk for waste segregation will not be effective. However, if we take example B, we see that in this case, risk is a critical factor. It shows a big difference between doers and non-doers. Therefore, in this case, informing people on the environmental and health risk related to not separating the waste by putting posters on the street, emission and radio will be the most effective one. So let's summarize what we heard about in this module. We first saw that changing behavior is a complicated task, and to do it, it's not sufficient to just supply an infrastructure to make people use it. Then we also saw that actually all the factors influencing a behavior can be put into 5 categories: risk, attitude, norm, ability, and self-regulation. And we also saw that a systematic approach can actually help you to design your interventions and target specific psychological factors in order to have more impact. If you want to know more about how to use Ranas in your project, you can find some document online in the following two websites.